my book came out on Saturday, just gone, and I wanted a chance to talk a little bit about it, give it a bit of a launch, and also say thank you to a few of the people that were very much involved in making it happen in the first place. So the intention for this session, if you see my slightly wiggly agenda here, there's a little bit of a welcome which we're in at the moment. In a minute, I'm going to hand over to David, who's going to talk a little bit about his research into CIOs. And David will introduce that and explain a bit more about that. There's very much some correlation with some of the discoveries and the position that we got to. I'll talk a little bit about the headline conclusions from the book. Depending on how we're running for time as well, I'll do a little reading for you as well from one of the ruder chapters in the book. And then effectively the rest of it is then open to a bit of a Q&A. I also did offer, and I did say at the beginning of the, or in the invite for the thing, that I've got a stack of books behind me to give away. I'm not going to draw them live, but Juliet will organize that in the background based on who's here, and we can share some books out. We'll worry about that later. So that's the plan, okay? And if you have burning questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll make sure we come back to all of that when we get to the Q&A bit later on. Right, I think that sounds like a plan. So David, I shall hand to you and get you started, if that's
Great.
all right.
Thank you, Stephen. Wonderful. Well, good evening, everybody. Nice to meet you all. Stephen and I have been talking for quite a while about all sorts of things. I won't reveal all the subjects we've covered, Stephen. I have copious notes. But at some point in the not too distant past, we were talking about leadership. And I was probably complaining to Stephen about the pain I was feeling with trying to wrap my brains around this huge subject of leadership. And probably around about that time, for some crazy reason, I decided to do a PhD part-time on the Chief Information Officer, and very much from a sort of a personal experience of having worked with quite a few CIOs over the last 15 years or so. I'm currently employed as a part-time professor of management practice at the University of Bedfordshire, where I work with business owners and business leaders to help grow their organizations. And when I'm not at the university chasing students around the block, I'm progressing additional research around technology leadership. I'm starting to look at the effects of AI and decision-making on such roles. But before I mention that, perhaps later on this evening, I'll just run you through some of my background and also some of the key findings from this sort of 8-year epic part-time PhD process. So we can jump to the next slide, Stephen, on the little graph there. So many years ago, I was trying to figure out my career. I won't tell you, try not to read the dates on the bottom left-hand side of this diagram. But at some point, having been employed in a small number of consultancies and doing some freelance work, I found myself facing off to one of the 5 chief information officers at the London 2012 Olympics. Again, I'll spare you all the gory details as to why there were 5 CIOs, but I managed to survive that for 2 years. I was head of IT program assurance. And when I finished that experience, I started to think to myself, maybe I should stop doing this freelance stuff and maybe I should get a proper job and maybe become a chief information officer. And around about that time, I got chatting to a contact at Cranfield University, somebody I'd known for many years. And I was complaining to him about how hard my life was working with CIOs. And he looked at me and said, do you still want to do a PhD? And I said, well, I'm not sure. It's a bit of a loaded question. He said, you should do a PhD in CIOs. So that's kind of how I got started. This is about 8 years ago, give or take. And the question I started with, and for those of you who've done research or perhaps PhD type research before, I don't know what your experience was, but mine was kind of swimming around in a sea of fog for many years and getting increasingly lost in the weeds. And my initial problem was I didn't really have a proper or properly defined research question to start, which made it very, very hard. So my initial question was how to become a CIO. What are they, and how could I possibly reach the heady heights of sitting in the boardroom and have this great title? So I jumped into the PhD. Go to the next slide, Stephen. The logic at the time was when I get my PhD, I will be a CIO. And of course, it didn't quite work out like that. And when I started to look at the literature on the CIO, so if you don't know, the Chief Information Officer, the term was first coined in the late 1980s by a guy called Sinnott. And there is a lot of research out there. I stopped counting at 10,000 plus peer-reviewed papers going back to 1980. And yes, I did have to figure out of those 10,000 papers which ones I was going to try and read. One thing I realized quite quickly is, particularly in the context of the CIO, there are a lot of descriptions of leadership. And because it was kind of a new subject for me at the time, I really found it quite frustrating to figure this stuff out. I have multiple spreadsheets with lists of descriptors of leadership for technology leaders and CIOs. So there's an awful lot of frameworks out there. And the other thing I noticed was every paper I read bore no relevance to any other paper, which kind of told me straight away that every article I'd read felt like a standalone piece of research. So in my speak, one of the key things which was being missed or ignored by researchers was the relevance of the environment in which the CIO was operating in, or relevance of context on this diagram. So on reflection of the research, the conclusion I came to was everybody's trying to find a one-size-fits-all framework or description of leadership, and because each role is highly contingent on the specific circumstance, then it was going to be almost impossible to figure out how to describe or come up with a unified model of chief information officers. And I suspect that because of this one-size-fits-all and this high level of contingency or uniqueness of environment, it probably explains why there's so much research out there, because everybody's trying to describe a unique circumstance, but nobody's really trying to progress some sort of holistic unified model. The two citations or two quotes on the bottom there kind of really summed it up for me when I kind of stopped for 6 months and went on holiday to try and refresh my brain. And this is from a book in 1994. Somebody's quoting there were 7,000 citations in the book of leadership. Now that's 20 years ago, so I suspect it's increased a little bit since then. But the comment at the bottom by Bennis and Nanus really summed it up for me, probably reflecting my mood at the time, is that never have so many labored so long to say so little. Now, I'm not saying I totally agree with that, but that kind of struck a chord with me as I got to that point. So I did my literature review, reflected a lot on the original research question, and came up with a better view or a more informed view of the problem I was trying to address with the research. So we go to the next slide, Stephen. And I've tried to draw it. I like drawing things. It's much easier for me to kind of convey this. So the view I came up with, so I was reflecting on about 15 years of my own personal experiences of working alongside, working for, and trying to influence CIOs, and all this literature, the body of knowledge I've been reading for the last, by this time, 4 years. And the main conclusion I came up with, or the main model or description of a problem I came up with, is that nobody can agree on what the role is. If you look at 3 or 4 different CIOs and get people to explain their roles to you, you'll get 3 probably quite different descriptions. So on the left-hand side of this diagram, the view I took was that stakeholders for CIOs all have different, sometimes opposing expectations. And this is why you get CIOs who are highly technical and perhaps should be CTOs. And you also get CIOs who aren't technical and perhaps should be COOs. And between those 2 extremes, there's a whole bunch of different types of individuals involved in that. if you look at the top of the diagram, one thing I think we'd all agree is that the world's getting more fast, or business environments are getting increasingly dynamic. There's an argument that says that the reason things are getting more dynamic is because digital technologies, are helping us gather, interpret, and respond to data much more quickly than we used to. So business environments are increasingly dynamic. And if you're a stakeholder operating in one of those changing environments, it's likely you're going to be changing your mind about stuff perhaps 2 or 3 times a week. And again, I've worked in situations where people are physically out of breath because they're trying to react to this changing environment. So my logic was that if people's are working in those types of areas, then the expectations they hold of each other are also likely to be changing quite quickly. Now, for the CIO, there's certainly a lack of kind of personal and professional development opportunities. There's a whole bunch of stuff behind this, but in summary, it's basically getting over the idea that if you're a practicing CIO and you want to improve yourself in some ways, you can go back to university and do an MBA, or you can try and find some sort of exec development course, or maybe try and turn to the British Computer Society or to a number of other sort of professional bodies, and you're still not really going to get an answer to this question of how to deal with people rapidly changing their minds about what they expect from you. And all this does have a demotivating effect. So a term I was reading a lot about, you might have heard it, is ambiguous. So the CIO's role is ambiguous. Because the role is ambiguous, and CIOs don't have few opportunities to improve and develop and respond to that ambiguity, they tend to get demotivated. And this might explain right back to the 1980s, there's a long, rich history of research showing that the relative tenure, or how long CIOs stay in post, is relatively less than other C-suite execs. And if you keep losing your CIO on a fairly frequent basis and having to re-recruit your CIO, given the importance of digital technologies now, there's probably going to be some significant impact on your business. So what does all this mean? So I kind of got to this question at the bottom saying, well, why don't we help CIOs to learn about how to survive and thrive, to steal Stephen's phrase, in these increasingly dynamic, sort of really crazy environments. So let's go on to the next slide, Stephen. Guys, am I making sense so far? You're all very quiet. I can see some nodding faces. I don't see anybody shaking their heads. Or okay, good stuff. So the big idea. Let's try and stick with this. Sure. Okay. But we'll stick with this big idea. And the idea is, well, let's not try and define comprehensive lists of things CIOs as leaders should be. Why don't we just recognize that each list is bound to be quite unique? So I picked up a theory called role making, which is part of organizational role theory. And the best way to think of this, if any of you are mums or dads or brothers or sisters, that is a role you have. It applies in your place of work as well. And the people you interact with, maybe before you meet them, may have a preconception of what a mum, a dad, a brother, a sister should actually be, or how they should behave. Same logic here. What is expected of a CIO in terms of behaviors, and how do they actually respond to those expectations? So we just click through the rest of the slides, Stephen. I just want to come back very briefly to this question of, so who expects what from a CIO? So from the literature, there's a whole bunch of stuff, but the headline is, if you develop a certain attribute, a skill, or a knowledge, or if you change your reporting line, then by some miracle, firm performance changes. Okay. So I wasn't quite kind of satisfied with that. It didn't seem to make much sense to me. So I did the next best thing. I analyzed 3,000 job adverts for UK CIOs, which I don't recommend, by the way. It's not much fun. But the key themes which are coming out from all these adverts for UK CIOs are that CIOs are expected to know stuff. They're expected to have skills. They're expected to behave in a certain way. They're expected to maintain some sort of profile, usually in terms of status or rank, or perhaps previous budgets they've managed. And what was missing almost entirely from all 3,000 job adverts was a clear explanation of why the the position was being advertised. In other words, what is the purpose of the role? I've got a whole bunch of stuff behind this. There's a paper presented at a conference a couple of years ago, which goes into some detail, which if you're interested, let me know. I can share that with you. So having just kind of identified these 5 main themes of expectations, knowledge, skills, behaviors, etc., I decided to go and talk to some real people. So I ran some surveys with CIOs and their stakeholders. It's quite tricky getting 200 CIOs to respond to a 45 question survey, but many of them did. So I'll be eternally thankful for that. And Stephen, if we just step through to the last but one slide. The thing I found, and I'm back on Stephen. The thing I wanted to try and do was to compare what CIOs thought they should have in terms of skills, knowledge, behaviors, blah, blah, blah. But perhaps equally importantly, what the stakeholders thought they should have. So I looked at behaviors, knowledge, and skills, which are kind of a key aspect of competence. Again, it's another kind of subject area I won't get into. But I also wanted to figure out what people thought about what CIOs should be learning, and perhaps how they should learn as well, but also how CIOs should be motivated. So I got a whole bunch of opinions and views on this. And when I compared expectations, I looked at a group of people in a low digital maturity environment, so a fairly traditional IT environment. I compared them to people who claim to be operating in a high-tech, highly sort of digital mature environment. So I was looking for the effects of the environment on those expectations. And the thing I found, you can't see it on the behaviors one at the top there, but what was really striking is in low digital maturity environments, in immature IT departments and businesses, the expectation is for CIOs, sorry, to be behaving very much as a change agent, whereas in a high digital environment, behaviors, expectations for a CIO's behaviors were very much around relationship building, which kind of made sense to me. The light bulb moment from all this, you're probably thinking, well, so what? This is kind of interesting. People have different views of the CIO in different environments. And what I realized was it's not critical to come up with the right list, because as I said at the beginning of this presentation, the list of expectations will be unique, probably depending on circumstances, the size of the firm, the CIO's position, the firm's appetite for investing in digital technologies, and the list goes on and on and on. What I realized quite quickly was it's not getting the right list. It's not the descriptor of leadership, which is the critical thing here. It is gaining agreement on what's expected from a CIO in terms of their attributes. And then after you've kind of baselined this, accept that's going to keep changing. So in other words, it becomes a process of sense. I think a phrase Stephen uses in his book, sense checking what's expected. And I view this sense checking process as a continual learning process. So the other kind of unexpected conclusion for me from this particular research was, if you're going to set up a training school for CIOs to help them develop professionally, don't just focus on knowledge, on sharing knowledge with them. Don't train them in AI or SAP or some vendor-driven stuff. Take it to the next stage. Get them to apply that knowledge in a real-world environment, and then sense check with their stakeholders if that's working for them or not. So this process of sense checking, of acquiring knowledge, of applying knowledge, and checking backwards and forwards in 2 directions is a learning process. So the main conclusion I've come to is, if you want to be a CIO and you want to deal with constant change, and if you want to develop and become, in the eyes of your stakeholders, more effective, i.e. you do what's expected, then this might be an alternative way to think about leadership development for CIOs. But the whole thing's premeditated on you can't describe the role. You can baseline it, and then it's constant change going forward. And just to the last slide, Stephen. So I'm hoping this is making sense. So I'm trying to share an awful lot of information in a very short amount of time. So the way I'm thinking about this, you can use this framework, this process, to define the role, to assess individuals in the role, and to work with that individual to develop their their attributes or their knowledge, their skills, their competencies, their motivations in the role as they actually try to meet those changing expectations. Well, one last thing, I'll say two last things just to summarize. This idea of role making and sense checking, it isn't a one-way process. So if you're a CIO and you expect to know something and have certain skills, and your stakeholders disagree, there's two options: either influence your stakeholders to agree with you, or listen to your stakeholders and change your views about yourself to meet their expectations. But either way, there's a change, with the leadership, with a perspective on the leadership role. And just hit last button, Stephen.
Ooh, wrong one.
Okay, back one. So this is my kind of little punchy outline. If you can master managing rapidly changing expectations for your role, if you can do it well, then I would say you're being effective. And effective for me is a better measure of performance, as opposed to did you reduce the costs in the company? Yeah, and there's a whole conversation behind that statement. So I've been talking to you about CIOs. I've also been talking to you about those stakeholders around CIOs, their superiors, maybe CEOs, their colleagues, their peers, in the boardroom, CXX suite, and also people who report into CIOs. So all these groups of people have these expectations, but it's all very CIO centric. So when I've kind of been bouncing off the walls and trying to articulate this with my conversations with Stephen over the years, one thing I'm quite curious about, and one thing I was also kind of really interested to see in his book, is this seems to support, this is an aspect of supporting some of his content. But I guess my question to Stephen and the group, perhaps for later discussion, is how does this apply to other business leadership roles or not, which would be interesting to kind of figure that out. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for the opportunity to talk, and hopefully, guys, that made some sense.
Thank you, David, very much. We'll come back round to questions, and thank you. There's a couple of a couple of things that have just appeared in the chat as well. So thank you. Okay. I'm just going to talk for a little bit about the book, and then we'll open it up. This isn't a huge room of people, so there's plenty of opportunity for people to have a chat, I'm sure. I just wanted to start with one thing, because people might have noticed that on the book, and in various places, I identify myself now as Stephen E. Morris, which makes me sound much more pretentious than I probably am. There are a few people in this room actually that probably still remember calling me Steve, which was before I was even that pretentious, I suppose, which is quite a long time ago.
I'm David J. Harding, Stephen.
You're David J. Harding. Yeah, you're just as pretentious as me, David. You see, that's the thing.
Oh dear.
The truth is that I'm not the drummer in Joy Division, and I don't own either of these shipping companies that I regularly see around, and I certainly don't want to be confused with those, and perhaps don't want them to be confused with me. So it's somehow to make me findable, which I suppose is pretentious, actually. I've probably backed myself into my own corner there, but anyway. Right, so I was just going to give you a headline, an overview of the book. I know a few of you on this call have had the chance to read it and run through it, some people in much more detail. I know I'm looking at you with that particularly. But I've tried to summarize the backbone of the book. And in that way, I think, hopefully I can answer David's question about relating to other people. So where I've started with all of this, and I go into depth in the book, of course, is a permanent question about how to operate in organizations, how to lead, how to run teams, how to deliver projects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And many of us are on a quest to do that. And you find that stuff absolutely everywhere. Everybody and their dog has got something that they can offer you to say, well, if you're doing a change, then you should be, use ADKAR, because that's definitely better than Kotter, and that's definitely, et cetera. It goes on and on and on. As I've dived into that, what I've kind of discovered right underneath all of that, right underneath all of these practices and stuff that doesn't get talked about, there's this layer of confusion almost. So I'll just briefly talk to some of these. The first is that there's no historical template for success. You look back in history, you look back at the great leaders of history, and actually when you examine any of that stuff, it's all in the eye of the beholder. So that doesn't particularly give you a template. As I said, everyone's got their opinions, and that actually arrives at what is hundreds, or what are hundreds of different leadership styles that you could particularly apply. Actually, if you take something like servant leadership or authentic leadership, there are tens of definitions of each of those. So that's already confusing. You then discover that the actual impact a leader has in an organization, even if you can measure it, and that is fraught with difficulty by itself, it's pretty small because there are so many other things like chance, organizational timing, and so on. Contexts keep changing. And then finally, and the kind of the nail in the coffin for me for this stuff was that virtually all of the methods that we talk about on a regular basis have no proof. Social sciences are notoriously difficult to actually prove. And even if you imagine that you've got a control group trying to demonstrate something, that control group is still a different group of people with different experiences, different knowledge, different tacit knowledge that affects the results of what you're doing. The two simple examples I quote all the time are Maslow, which has definitely got no proof, and the other one, which I particularly enjoyed, is the forgetting curve, which seems to be quite popular. People talk about that a lot. That was something that was developed by one guy testing himself in his own laboratory. And yet we talk about it on leadership courses as if it's normal. There's a lot of reasons for that. And again, I talk about some of this stuff in the book. The first one's obvious. The industry we're talking about is worth a hell of a lot of money to an awful lot of people. So there's no real interest in telling you that a particular framework might not work. Many of the frameworks as well are a legacy of various social order setup. So if you think of a standard artisan management, for example, or the guilds in the Middle Ages, that was all about reinforcement of social conformity. And that thinking is continued. We've got lots of human relationships in here, i.e. we trust and we defer to the people that seem to know more. The classic IT phrase of nobody ever got fired for buying IBM, but that very much applies to McKinsey, to all of these other people as well, when they come in and say, yep, you should organize like this. And then finally, doing something other than a template is actually really hard. It's not the number one priority for people, and it needs skill. And of course, if you're wrong, or rather you risk being wrong, so it creates vulnerability. Thank you, John, for just adding there's 170 types of leadership. Brilliant. We need to talk about that. That's even reinforces the point very much. What the conclusion that I come to in the book, and the thing that I do with my clients, and I particularly try and support, which links back to David's point about this continuous discovery working between the CIO and their colleagues and the organization, is to continually try and make sense of what's going on around you. And by that, I mean actually have good conversations, open conversations with colleagues, be open to disagreement and different opinions, and discover why there are different opinions. And the theory, as it were, or the suggestion that I'm making is that then might lead you to say, in this particular context right now, for this particular leader with this particular team, those things are likely to work more than perhaps something else. But exactly, again, as David said, this is a constant conversation. It's not just we used Scrum on that project over there, and therefore we will use Scrum on every other project in our organization forever. That's unfortunately going to land you into some at least inefficient situations. So that's broadly the backbone of the book. I talk about that stuff and describe where I came to that conclusion from and the evidence, as it were, that sits behind that. And then the second part of the book then tries to examine more of the second half of the book then looks at a product development lifecycle from the perspective of, or more of the perspective of context at least, and thinking about how that works. So that's basically it. I'm delighted to take some questions on that and a little bit when we get there. Is it indulgent for me to read a bit? I asked ChatGPT and it said you should read a bit, apparently in my agenda, but it feels a bit indulgent. I don't know.
I think you should go for it.
Yeah,
Ben,
go for it.
Please do.
Yes.
Please
Go for it.
Yep, agreed.
Can you do it in this style of Ralph Fiennes?
On the basis that this is being recorded and it might therefore end up on a public platform.
Please edit that out.
Me doing anything that involves Yeah, exactly. I'm not going to do anything that does that. So I will tell you what. I'll talk to a bit because we've been talking a lot about leadership. So I don't just talk about leadership. I talk about a lot about delivery and operation in organizations because those two things arguably are sort of they're so intertwined. So I'll read you a short bit, all right, and then we'll move on to letting everyone else talk about stuff. So this is in chapter 5, which is about, look, I've even got a slide for it, which is about delivery. And this is just setting up the idea that there are, as we've been talking about, lots of different ways to do things. So imagine that we're about to embark on a project that will turn all of those glitzy slides into something that people can actually benefit from. Before we run away with ourselves, there's an elephant to name first, and that is, which approach to delivery should we take? With a feeling of deja vu for the choices available, it's easy to get lost. Should we work with the more popular Scrum or Prince2, projects in controlled environments? Or how about picking up PMI's project management body of knowledge and applying that to our world-changing idea? Perhaps you should get someone certified in Kanban, SAFe, LESS, MSP, PMP, CAP, M, PGMP, PFMP, PMI ACP, PMI PBA, PMI RMP, PMI SP, or OPM3. To make some sense of what to do, I reduced the choices to 3. Choice number 1, JFDI. Just do it may conjure up an inspirational and affirmative swoosh, but just effing do it is probably the experience you're more likely to have in the office. Something like, here are 3 infallible reasons why this won't work. CEO. JDI. They really are infallible though. CEO, JFDI. If the work is small enough, although what small is obviously subjective, we can take it in our stride and deliver it alongside everything else. Indeed, repetitive, well-documented and well-established activities are less likely to need close governance and risk management, so we can just get on with them. Simple, obviously. In the meantime, for larger and more complicated work with different moving parts, we need something more coordinated and sensitive to events. As the US Department of the Army saying goes, prior planning prevents piss-poor performance. Very sage. And not to be outdone, the US Marines include an additional P. Prior proper planning prevents piss-poor performance. Pardoning the imagery, there's something rather golden in those phrases. Both explicitly state that you can plan your way to good performance. While there very much is value in planning, the idea that we could have avoided every disaster or secured every ambition with better planning is false and something you should be wholly skeptical of by now. And so here enter 2 main schools of thought around project delivery. And then I go on to choice 2, which is talking a bit about waterfall delivery. And then the third one is more about agile, or rather adaptive-based project delivery in organizations. I try and describe those, or rather I lay those out and end up with a conclusion without spoiling the punchline. I hope you can already see some broad overlap in all of those methods. While some people will guide you to the idea that you must only do one of these things, and as we've seen, that's typically agile good, waterfall bad, JFDI worse, my view is that we're doing all of them all of the time. The rest of it is marketing. And then I demonstrate that with a further, deeper look into agility. And then that's where I go into, I don't particularly, I go much deeper. There we go. A short introduction to some of the stuff in the book and the style of the book, at least. It's not all rude, but some of it is. Thank you. Thank you.
When does the audiobook come out?
When does the... yeah, good question. I'd like to do an audiobook. So
You should.
Thank you, Carl. I'd like to. I really would. There's an awful lot of pictures in here, and I'm delighted that we're joined by Nick Gauman here, who is the absolutely phenomenal cartoonist or illustrator for this book. There are 12 illustrations through the book. Some of you will have seen some of that on LinkedIn already. And actually, I'll hold that thought for a second, actually, because I can just show you a couple of little behind the scenes things, and then we'll get into chat, because otherwise this is just a lecture and that's not what anybody wants. Ever so briefly, I'll talk about this and then I'll go to some stuff about artwork. I had 101 titles for this book along the way, but I just wanted to call out two things, and you're welcome to use any of the previous titles for books you want to write. I began this journey with the Open Leader Method, which was a training course that I developed, a leadership training course that I developed based on a business development course that I attended. And as I started writing it, I kind of discovered that I didn't believe myself. If you listen to what we've been talking about tonight, that there's no right answer and it's all context dependent, how dare I go out there and tell an organization what to do before I've even met them? It's rubbish. So that was the first draft that got torn up. And then I've gone through this kind of journey. I ended up at the final title because the people I want to kind of hold accountable for the situation that we're in are the providers. They are the large consultants and the training providers who are just interested in selling time and their way, as it were. And I think that's a deceit, because while they may sell it and maybe it will be useful, I've never heard a vendor go into an organization and say, you could try it, but I'm not sure it's going to work. They will just say, how many people do you want to get qualified in SAFE, or whatever it might be. And that's the reason why the title ended up where it did. So I'll just stop. I'll skip this bit. Nick, just briefly, I'll just call him out here. Thank you, Caroline. Always wanted me to have grumpy cats somewhere in there, and you're quite right. So I met Nick at an event, a LinkedIn local event, many years ago, and I think the cartoon on the right, the T-Rex, I actually had on my fridge for a while, or a version of it that my son at the time was very delighted to have. And I thought it would be a brilliant thing to work with him at some point. And I was delighted to say we got there. So as a final kind of note on that, what the text at the bottom of these is what I gave Nick. So I had a kind of an idea in my mind of what they would be. These are the two preliminary sketches from him. And then I'll just show you what these two ended up with. We ended up with these absolutely gorgeous images, which decorate the book, but each of them has got a bit of a point to it. At least he's being authentic, is kind of self-explanatory. The coffin one on the left-hand side was an organization I worked for, and there are a couple of people that used to work for that organization too on the call, who had a forced fun Friday, where Friday was Fun Day Friday, and you just, that was the day to be silly and enjoy yourself at work. And it was kind of spurred by that idea. But there we go. This is more than indulgent. I'm going to hand over to the room and just see what people want to do. In fact, I'm just going to stop sharing, because then we can see each other a bit more easily.
You've had some questions in the chat, Stephen.
Okie dokie.
Regarding your book, how much is your book directed to CIOs and how much to leaders in general, not just in tech?
That's a good question. I started writing it as it was intended to be leaders with any responsibility for people or getting something done. So I didn't really pin it to a seniority. I think, Nick, when you read through it, I think your take was that this was useful for sort of somewhere in the middle of their journey, as something to help them understand a bit more about what's going on under the surface of stuff. Truthfully, I'm just happy if it finds some kind of home out there and, it helps a couple of people achieve something, really. I would say that the message of it is relevant to them all, but whether or not it's pitched in the right way to actually get a CEO to take notice, especially some of the CEOs that I've been working with recently who have got tens of thousands of employees underneath them, then that's a different question. What was your perception?
Were you thinking outside of tech as well? And the reason I asked the question is because when I read it, I thought it was directed to leaders in general, people who wanted to learn about leadership in general, although they might think that there's quite a lot, and not surprisingly, there's quite a lot of sort of tech digital kind of examples in there, because that's your background. And then when I got the invitation to this call, I said, oh, it's about CIOs. This, oh, I didn't realise that. Particularly, so I wondered how sort of beyond tech you had in mind.
So I genuinely, a lot of this has been written working with, or the examples and experiences are written with non-tech leaders, as well as tech leaders, and of course the wonderful relationship between those two camps, as it were. All of that has come from me as sort of a lay person, I suppose, going through it. The CIO link is very much David's work, and we just found a kind of happy harmony between us with basically the same conclusion that there's no recipe for this stuff, but unfortunately the practices, say recruitment practices in David's case, or delivery practices or whatever in organizations, whether it's a CIO or not, assumes that it's still in a sort of Taylorist world. We assume that we can scientifically organize things and still achieve something reliable each time.
Stephen, I was curious because in reading your book, I was curious about, and I was thinking about, the nature of the work that we do, working with clients and so forth. Do you find, in your opinion, where do you see this approach more effective? Do you see like the internal organizations doing the context searching, the sense making themselves, or do you find it more effective if they had somebody that they work with who's had more experience in the industry? Like, I was curious what your thoughts around it. Because it's very complex, right? To get to a point where you find out or you determine what would make more sense and how do we shift? How do we adjust? Or how do we do like a combination of to be more effective?
Thank you, Rochelle. I think there's maybe a few ways to kind of answer, I think. And please come back if I haven't quite answered your question. My sense is in organizations, it's kind of, you need to make sense of the organization in a way to understand where this would pay most or create most value, most impact in an organization, in a group. Sorry, Rochelle, would you mind repeating the question again? I think I've lost it. I've had too many beers.
Oh, no worries. I was more curious about, I think I'm also thinking about within my context as I was reading it and thinking, I do agree. I guess being in the industry for quite some time that there's no cookie cutter solution. But at the same time, to get to a point to determine what is the context of our situation and how do we continuously do the sense making to actually find out what's effective. Do you find that organizations should rely on their knowledge internally to figure that out, or work with, people outside of who has that, different perspective, right? To work with them.
So kind of a bit of both, and thank you. And I apologize. I will, if I do anything like this again, I will drink more water. So the key is, I suppose, so part one is that an organization is always going to know more about itself than any external consultant coming in. And that's kind of unfortunately the problem when we try and kind of drop a framework on a company. But organizations and leadership training and activity does not seem to talk to the skill of sense making, the idea that things are a bit vague and ambiguous and so on. They expect an external vendor. I think, James, you put a question on there similarly. They expected an external vendor to come along and have an answer for stuff. Where the external vendors are, where we, as it were, those consultants on the call can really help is to support organizations in learning how to make sense of their situation in a better way, teach them some of those techniques so that it's agnostic then of the practice that sits behind it. It doesn't always work. I got great success with a team recently where I was invited in to work with a team who said, we want to be agile. We've been told that it can help. And I managed to get there early enough to say, well, what actually are you trying to do? And what we did was an entirely different and a completely made up exercise, but a sense making exercise where we examined the work that they were doing and discovered that actually that wasn't where we were trying to go at all. So that's always a challenge. A lot of this, if any of you are familiar with David Snowden and trying to explain Cynefin to someone or any of those tools, it's bloody difficult. And it's really hard to sell, because effectively what you need to do is say, talk to us. We can help you have meaningful conversations with each other where we'll kind of dig up all of the skeletons that exist around your organization so you can actually tell the truth to each other for once, and then maybe we can move forward. And that's clearly when you've got, a shiny suited McKinsey person next to you saying, have you heard about what Spotify did with their organization? It's impossible to kind of compete in that way. Where it tends to work is coming in after things have gone wrong with a default sort of setting. And they say, oh, well, maybe we can examine that then. That didn't work. The classic thing of the tools are broken and so on. But back to the point, we don't teach that sort of stuff. An MBA doesn't teach you how to make sense of this kind of information in an organization. And it certainly doesn't encourage different members of an organization to cross-pollinate with each other and work things out together. It assumes that the CIO knows their stuff and so on.
I agree. But
Stephen,
no, thank you for that.
Stephen, do
Go
you mind
ahead,
if I yes, apologies, guys. You said something, Rochelle, about context. One thing I suppose it is the learning point for me, and again, I can only talk from the angle specifically of CIOs. That's the area I did my sort of deep dive into. But it applies in most situations. It's this idea that any individual, particularly a senior, experienced, high-ranking, high-status, highly paid individual with a large salary, somehow is singularly impactful on measurable or tangible aspects of firm performance. So the obvious ones are financial performance, revenues up and costs down, all that sort of stuff. The thing I think I see is an acceptance that an individual should be held directly and solely accountable for those sort of quite high level measures of firm performance. So when we talk about context and environment, I suspect, well, obviously I don't know, I suspect a lot of people start thinking about measurable aspects of the business. So if you're the CIO and your costs in your IT department went too high and some customers were not happy and their satisfaction went down and revenues dipped, then it must be the CIO's fault. So the implication is that there's something the CIO is doing with their 5,000 resources, which is causing the problem. Whereas my logic would be, well, maybe there's some other problem areas amongst those 5,000 people you can't see. So in other words, why would you even attempt to pin a tangible measure of performance or context onto any one individual? It makes no sense. Assuming there's more than two people in a firm, then there's got to be other sources of impact on firm performance. So in other words, it's quite hard, I think, to break down that mindset of firm performance reflects an individual's performance. To me, it makes no sense at all. But I suspect that's a barrier which is really hard to break down when you're trying to get into this conversation about sense making as well. But again, that's just what I saw from the CIO literature. So there may be different views on that.
Thank you, David. Thank you. We've got time for maybe one or two more questions.
There's a question in the chat, Stephen, from Andrew. Does the book suggest approaches for exposing context and issues and how to get organizations to recognize what might work?
Yes. Although I think what I do is I kind of start the conversation. So I've got an explanation, for example, of Cynefin in there, which is, I think, a tricky thing to explain, but I think I've done a fair job with conveying how that might help. The thing that I think I got stuck on, actually, when I started with Cynefin, I kind of thought, wow, this is brilliant. This answers every problem. And then when you start reading and start thinking about it, you discover that there's another 50 such kind of tools out there, and you can create your own anyway. So I've explained a number of those and things that may encourage you to then go off and look and discover your own. And what I have got in the second half of the book are some examples. So some sort of worked examples of using those techniques with teams, so that there's a, hopefully you're not starting from zero. But that kind of reflects a little bit to Rochelle's point about where that how to get this into organizations. This is where bringing an expert into an organization to help you have those initial conversations, get your training wheels off, and then you don't need the consultant anymore to help you with that bit.
Could I ask you a quick question, Stephen?
Of course you can, Mark.
Amazing. Well done. You're doing brilliantly, and I'd love to hear an audiobook. I think you've got a lovely way of saying things. We had a conversation, I think about 6 or 8 weeks ago. So I'm going to be honest with you. I haven't read the book yet. I'm currently reading The Myth of Normal, the Gabor Mate book at the moment. Oh, yeah. And you're being truly authentic in yourself. Well done for that. So my question is around that ability for people to be their authentic selves when you're in a position of well up a business, because sometimes when you want to be authentic, it can be seen as weak by other people that are portraying this idea that you're on the board, so therefore you must be powerful, you must be strong, you must have all the answers. So is there any, one of the stats there was 170 different types of leadership styles. So how can we be our authentic selves when there's this idea of people in the boardroom to be, you can't show weakness, and you can't, so is there anything from the book's perspective, or is that what you would class the deceivers out there, the people that aren't being true to themselves, aren't being true to their business, and just following what they think they know is the right way?
Thank you, Mark. I think for me that links to, and this is definitely in the book, some stuff about groups and sort of a group theory, i.e., that you have an identity with all sorts of different groups. You've got an identity with your boardroom, you've got an identity with your family. All of us have got an orchestra. We're not just soloists. There's a lot going on, and there's lots of different parts to ourselves. The challenge with the authenticity thing, and that's kind of why I had the lion eating the business person, because I think I pretty much say that in the book. It's great that the leader's authentic as long as they're not a bastard, because obviously that's not going to really help anybody's day. But that's the thing, we all put kind of different hats on, different coats on, and what's to say that, and this is where it gets into a kind of fluffy argument, what's to say that isn't authentic? You go home at night and give your kids a hug, and you've just fired 1,500 people in the office. So your authentic person will be struggling with that maybe, but I suppose it echoes that point of there's an expectation, regardless of the fact that there isn't really a definition, there's an expectation of a behavior on all of us from other people all of the time. We all perceive something of people. I don't think I really answered the question other than to say it's really vague, really broad.
But there's something in the book. I will definitely read the book. Since I finished this one, I promise you, it'll be my next one.
But I definitely, the thing that if your leader is a sort of some sort of a brutal dictator, you probably don't want them to be authentic in most organizations. And that's one of the things I counter when people talk about, leaders should be authentic. Yeah, okay. It's such a difficult word to define, is the point I'm making.
Thank you.
Okay. I was just going to do one thing. I know quite a few people have done it, but I just wanted to talk a bit about context very, very briefly, because this is just one of my favorite exercises to do with anyone. Some of you in the room have done this before, so please don't spoil it for everyone else, if I may. But can I just ask you, if you can see that, just to take a look at that picture for me. Okay. Got it in mind? Okay. Now, all you've got to do is tell me the missing letter. Any offers?
A.
Thank you, Mark. Not you? Anyway, sorry, this is really obvious, isn't it? Excuse me. It's a child's game, really. But the point is, I do this quite often in talks, and you put that slide up and ask people the question, and you can I've never had anybody say you first. They always say A. And then when I've done it the other way round and I've shown them pictures of tomatoes, they've given me you each time. The reason I share that is when we were talking about context earlier and something like Cynefin talks to what we would think about as sort of natural sciences context. We determine whether or not something is straightforward and predictable or unpredictable. But that's only one type of context going on in an organization. You've got stuff like this happening at the same time as well. Back to your point, Mark, about authenticity. If your organization is expecting a certain kind of authenticity in its people, it's going to have, that is context that drives how stuff happens in your organization. So sense making is much wider than just that one thing about saying, oh, it's complex, and then saying everybody needs to use Scrum then, which doesn't make any sense. Framing, exactly, Stan, thank you. Right. I think we've just got one thing. I think we've got one thing left to do. Juliet, did you do your bit? It's quite a role reversal, me asking you to do things around the house.
I know, I've got a job. It's good, isn't it? Right, so I put everyone's names in a bag, and I've just picked, for speed, I've just picked out, was it 10?
10, yeah.
Get that right. Okay. So 10 people will get a signed book.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. Please tell me if you don't want it signed.
A signed book, and feel free to make up the caption that goes in it. So a signed book, if you have bought a copy already or you've been gifted it as a reviewer, please feel free to gift it on for the season of goodwill. So I'm going to read out the names. We have Carl, Ben, Andrew, Mark, 2, 3, 4, Victoria, Peter, Matthew, John, Dom, and Helena. I think that's 10.
Great.
Brilliant.
Well done.
So we'll get in contact via email with the address and make sure you get a signed copy. And I'm guessing you'll also put some bookmarks in there as well.
Yeah. You'll get some bits of swag.
Brilliant.
To go on
There
with
we
it.
go.
So there we go. We're a little bit over time, but it remains for me to just say a massive thank you for all of you coming online to come and join me this evening. It really does mean a lot, and thank you for the great questions too. One tiny ask is for anybody that does have a chance to read it. I would really appreciate a review, please. And that's even if you hate it and you think that actually you want to write a better book that disagrees with everything I've said, fine. Just the review would be lovely. I don't mind what it says.
And Stephen, I'd also like to thank you for inviting me along this evening. Our conversations,
Thank you, David.
Yeah, I wasn't joking when I said our conversation stopped me going completely mental through that 8-year journey. So I appreciate all the time you put into those conversations as well. So thank you for
that. Indeed, as Nick just said, a review from your authentic self, please. Yep, that's the one. Even if you are a bastard. Right. I think that's probably a good moment to stop. So a massive thank you to all again, and lovely to see you all. I'll see you around soon.
Well done, Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks very much.